Hello and welcome to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. On today's show, we have Matt Krayton. Matt does a lot of different things. I'm going to have Matt introduce himself, and the main topic of our show is going to be hydrogen. We're going to talk about hydrogen. We're going to talk about some policy stuff. We're going to talk about green hydrogen, pink hydrogen, any color of hydrogen that you want. We're going to talk about the environmental impacts, hydrogen hub development, all kinds of fun stuff. And one thing I wanted to just kind of mention here, just as we're starting off, is that hydrogen has been around for a long time. Everybody remember the Big Bang, right? So the Big Bang is when the universe started, according to the conspiracy theory that I go by, about 13.8 billion years ago. The whole universe fit on the head of a pin. And then what came out of it? The first thing that came out of it, as far as something physical, I believe, maybe some physicist would come up with some other kind of thing that came out of it, but hydrogen. Hydrogen was the first thing to come out of the Big Bang. And there's more hydrogen atoms in your body than any other atom. And there is a lot, especially since that other molecule that's made up from atoms like hydrogen and oxygen, which is called water. That's right, we're mostly water. So is that where our consciousness comes from? Hydrogen? I think so. That's my religion, at least. I'm from the hydrogen religion. Then we can look at our sun, two hydrogens smashing into each other. That becomes a helium, and that's where solar power comes from. And then we take that solar power, and what do we do with it? We send it back to Earth, goes through our PV modules, and we can send it to loads, we could send it to batteries, or we can send it to something called an electrolyzer. And that's a thing that splits water molecules back into hydrogen and oxygen. So we can breathe up that oxygen, and we can use that hydrogen to recombine with oxygen. And that's what a fuel cell does. So we can reuse that energy that we took and we split those water molecules with. So let's have Matt Krayton introduce himself. Hey, Matt.
Thanks for having me.
So let us know what you do and just kind of give an explanation of hydrogen and how that works and just kind of what your angle is.
Sure, absolutely. So I am the founder and principal of Publitics, which is a full service public affairs and strategic communications firm. We're based in New Jersey and have offices in DC, Philadelphia, and Wilmington, Delaware. So we tend to work on a lot of communications issues, one of which is renewable energy and the energy transition. And as a part of that, we've been doing a lot of work on developing out community engagement and communications around the Hydrogen Hubs project, specifically the Mach 2 hub that we're working with in the Mid-Atlantic region, which includes, as of now, southeastern Pennsylvania, southern New Jersey, and Delaware. So
maybe we could explain what a hydrogen hub is.
Sure, absolutely. So the Department of Energy created the Hydrogen Hubs program, the H2 Hubs program, to spur the development of 7 or so at the time. It was, between, I think it was 7 and 10 at the time that it was conceived, hydrogen hubs around the country. So essentially what a hydrogen hub is it's a network of hydrogen producers, connective infrastructure, and hydrogen consumers. So that's the basic idea. Interestingly enough, as we've been getting into this project, kind of start talking like, well, what is a hydrogen hub? And I think people have this picture in their head of a single building. Like, where is the hub? Like a building, they're thinking like a single facility, single structure. That's not it. It's actually just a network of different pieces of the puzzle.
Yeah, I've kind of heard people talk about hydrogen, like transmitting electricity by transmitting hydrogen. So you know how we have these high voltage power lines and there's voltage drop and things like that. Well, instead of sending electricity, you could send hydrogen across a pipe, which is kind of interesting. And then you don't have voltage drop.
Yeah, I mean, hydrogen is actually really interesting. As you noted, obviously, the molecule hydrogen has been around since the very beginning, but the conversations around what hydrogen can be used for have also been around for quite a while. I remember going back to like Arnold Schwarzenegger, right, trying to develop, or he purchased like that hydrogen powered Hummer or something like that out in California. So, we've been talking about this for a long time as a different means of energy storage, which is sort of how I like to think about hydrogen, like to explain it to people. So really right now, as we're speaking, hydrogen is being produced and transported all over the United States, right? So this is not a new thing either. Producing hydrogen is not new. You need it for a lot of different processes. that exists, especially in the heavy industrial space. But hydrogen itself, specifically clean hydrogen, can have a lot of applications, including the one that you noted, which is to help smooth out some of the peaks and valleys in renewable energy production. So at certain times of the day, the renewables in certain parts of the grid are producing more energy than is utilized, but there's no real effective or efficient way to store that energy right now. So what you could do with that is produce clean hydrogen via electrolysis and store that for later. So then when you have peaker plants, kicking on. So peaker plants being power plants that kick on when energy demand exceeds the renewables being produced and other types of renewables, that you could run a hydrogen plant as opposed to like a natural gas plant, for example. So the hydrogen theoretically, would have very low emissions in that circumstance. So you can actually use it to kind of smooth out the grid a little bit.
And so also, I know with hydrogen, you can put it through a fuel cell, and then you can also burn it like you can burn natural gas, which is kind of interesting. I mean, it's interesting too from a physics point of view, because when you burn hydrogen with oxygen, you get water. And you usually think of water putting out fires, not something that a fire makes. So I always thought that's interesting too. And so when you're talking about helping out, reducing peaker plants, all that kind of stuff, are you talking about using hydrogen with fuel cells or something like burning it, like in place of natural gas, or both?
So I think there are a lot of possibilities in this space. So fuel cells certainly could be a piece of the puzzle. I've heard, again, using hydrogen to operate turbines. I would have to refer to the, scientists and engineers working on those specific solutions. But I think there are a lot of possibilities for how that might actually be implemented in a low or no emissions way. So as you noted, when hydrogen combusts, it creates water vapor. In fuel cells in particular, there are no emissions or byproducts of that process. Whereas
Except for water.
except for
Yeah.
water, which is fine. That's not a problem. And some heat as well. When you combust hydrogen, there is some debate around how much NOx it creates. So that is one thing when you're just straight up combusting hydrogen that you have to keep an eye on. But that's something that can be captured either through like catalytic converters or other processes. And there's a lot of research and development going into figuring out how to make that work as well.
I mean, NOx too. I know that's a pollution, so that would be nitrogen and oxygen. But couldn't that just be laughing gas, and then it would just put everybody in a good mood?
So yeah, I'd have to
I have to ask my dentist.
on that one. Yeah, the dentist. Yeah. So
I was kind of messing around there. So.
yeah, exactly. It's
Uh-huh.
all- it's like the phone a friend on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. I'll call my
Uh-huh.
dentist. Yeah, so I mean, it is a byproduct. It's something that you kind of need to pay attention to. It is a criteria pollutant. It is a byproduct of combusting other types of fuels as well. So being able to tamp that down, I think, is top priority. So again, there's a lot of research and development going into figuring out how to make that work.
Great, great. Yeah, and another thing too that you hear about, a really good reason to use hydrogen, is for LDES, which stands for long duration energy storage. So the batteries work pretty good for when you're charging and discharging the same day or the next day, something like that. But if you want to take some summer energy and use it in the winter, then hydrogen's pretty convenient because you can store a whole bunch of it and use it later. And I guess one problem with that, though, is that hydrogen is pretty small. It's pretty much the smallest molecule out there, and it can leak also. So you hear about natural gas leak. So natural gas is pretty much methane, CH4. Then you've got hydrogen, and it's just H2, hydrogen gas. And storing that hydrogen gas, you have to worry about making something so it's real tight so it doesn't leak. But at least I guess, if it does leak, it's not some kind of terrible greenhouse gas like natural gas. If it leaks, that's bad. It's a greenhouse gas and all that kind of stuff, which is one of the reasons why they say from space you can see North Dakota, even though not that many people live there, because they have so many flares coming off of the wells that they're doing with natural gas that they can't afford to do anything with it. It's like they're mining for oil, and then they've got this extra natural gas. They probably should just capture it and use it for natural gas, but instead they flare it. So it's not a greenhouse gas because they're taking care of that planet by flaring it, not letting that greenhouse gas escape. So I just thought I'd mention that too.
Yeah, absolutely. I will say the cool thing about the H2 Hubs program is that it's going to spur a ton of innovation and research and development in the space of hydrogen. And that includes storage, transportation, safety. So all of these things are top priorities for that program. And the various partners and many of the hubs are looking at developing out those technologies. And again, like I had said before, hydrogen is being manufactured or produced and stored and transported today, but the bulk of that is not clean hydrogen. It's dirty hydrogen, right? It's done through steam methane reformation, which uses methane, splits the hydrogen atoms off of that, and the emission on that is, carbon dioxide.
I have a little bit of a chart here, and I'm looking at the different types. And so you have blue hydrogen, which means hydrogen produced from fossil fuels, where CO2 is captured and stored or repurposed. So that would be capturing the CO2. And then we have turquoise, hydrogen produced by thermal splitting of methane. And instead of CO2, solid carbon is produced. So maybe it would be turquoise?
Yeah, so a lot of the hydrogen produced today is actually gray hydrogen, so there's no carbon capture.
Oh, okay, that's the other one. Yeah, so then it says gray hydrogen right here. Hydrogen extracted from natural gas using steam methane reforming. This is the most common form of hydrogen production in the world today. Oh, I missed the gray. It was just not as bright. It was harder to see on this little table I'm looking at here. Great.
Yeah, no, there's a ton of gray hydrogen being produced. So at minimum, if you're producing more green, pink, or blue in certain cases, hydrogen, you're displacing the emissions from gray hydrogen right off the bat, right? So that's one of the benefits of this program is you're actually displacing that use. What I don't think a lot of people realize, like as we go around speaking with folks about this program, is that we are in fact producing hydrogen. Like this is happening today. You need it again for industrial processes, like in refining operations, for example, you need hydrogen for manufacturing of steel and cement and different things like that. So, I mean, you can actually displace a ton of bad hydrogen with clean hydrogen, which should be a benefit right off the top, low-hanging fruit.
So just kind of going back to this, the blue and the turquoise, so that looks like the colors that have blue in them because turquoise is sort of like a shade of blue. And both of those types of hydrogen, they're capturing the CO2. Whereas if you took the turquoise hydrogen and didn't capture the CO2, I believe, you're doing steam methane reformation is what they call it. Then that's how you get the gray hydrogen, which is most of the hydrogen production in the world. And the hydrogen that I like, being a solar person, is green hydrogen, and that's produced by electrolysis using renewable energy. And I also see another one where you can do electrolysis, and it could be by renewables or not. So perhaps green hydrogen would also be a form of yellow hydrogen, but yellow hydrogen could also be electricity from other sources. And just while we're at it, we've got white hydrogen, and it says hydrogen produced as a byproduct of industrial processes, also refers to hydrogen occurring in its rare natural form. I've read some articles about natural hydrogen recently, which is kind of interesting. And then I noticed too that when I was reading about you too, you were not just talking about green hydrogen, but also purple or pink hydrogen, which is electrolysis using nuclear power or nuclear energy.
Yes, yeah, it's funny. I wish I could find the person who developed the color coding system for this and urge them to go a different direction. Maybe it's a little confusing.
Yeah, some of them overlap. And let's see, I just read 8 of them. Actually, some of them said purple/pink and brown/black. So there's like purple/pink would be the same too, maybe just from different sources. Lots of different colors.
Yes, absolutely. So when we talk about hydrogen, typically we use the sort of main colors, don't get off into shades of blue or shades of purple or pink or anything like that. So really what we're talking about are green, pink, and then, well, I'll throw another one in there, orange hydrogen, which the definition of that depends on who you talk to. So in the case of the project that we're working on with Mach 2, there is a possibility that there could be one orange hydrogen project. And the definition of orange hydrogen is essentially, in this case, based on the feedstock, which would be biomethane from wastewater treatment, which is an unavoidable byproduct of wastewater treatment or, the decomposition of trash, for example, in a landfill. So you get methane from that. So essentially what you would do instead of flaring that methane, which you have to flare a certain percentage of that methane from wastewater treatment, you would instead capture that and run it through SMR and do carbon capture. And that would reduce emissions as well.
So can you define SMR?
So that's steam methane reformation.
Steam methane reformation.
Mhm.
So yeah, if somebody wants to, they can rewind and go back and study over and over again, and they'll have at least 9 different colors of hydrogen.
Yeah, that's right.
It's hard to remember. That's one reason why I just put a little chart in front of me so I could remember it. And so I know that I kind of stopped you while you were introducing yourself and what you do when you got to Hydrogen Hub. So did you want to go on from that too?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, like I said, we've been working with one of the Hydrogen Hub projects in the Mid Atlantic region. So, it's been a really interesting journey there from the application process into the DOE's announcement of Mach 2, the Mid Atlantic Clean Hydrogen Hub being eligible for up to $750 million in federal cost share for a variety of different projects. But again, we're talking producers, consumers, and connective infrastructure in the region. So,
That's kind of cool. Mach 2 being, say that again.
Mach 2. So, it's Mid Atlantic Clean Hydrogen Hub. So, the H2 being hydrogen. Yep.
Oh, great. Okay, great.
Yeah, so it's pretty cool. It lends itself to a lot of cool names. There are a couple of other ones like Arch 2, right, which is the Western Pennsylvania, West Virginia hub. So Appalachian Clean Hydrogen Hub, I believe. There was one other Mach 2 actually in the Midwest, but I think they changed their name slightly to avoid confusion. So
Yeah, I would think of it as being something like 15 or 1600 miles an hour or knots or whatever it is.
that's right, hurtling toward innovation and green energy space.
Uh-huh.
So
Maybe we can get a hydrogen powered jet that could do Mach 2, and then we got a couple of hydrogen definitions.
I think that's on the table actually. Trying to figure out aviation.
Great. Okay. And one thing I always like to mention too, when we talk about energy storage with hydrogen, is that it's less efficient than a lithium ion battery, which is one of the reasons why we have so many lithium ion batteries out there. So round trip efficiency, we're talking about energy turning into chemical storage like a battery, and then going back to the electrical energy again. So starting with electricity, going back to electricity. We're somewhere around 95% efficient with lithium ion batteries. And I know that hydrogen can get better. There's room for it to grow, but it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 35% efficient. And that would have been bad a while back when PV costs 3 times more than it does cost right now. But now with the price of renewables going down so much, it makes it cost effective because it costs a lot less to make electricity. And then another thing too is you might have times when you were like curtailing power and stuff like that. That means that there's more available than you can use at that time, and all the lithium-ion batteries are charged up. So you can put it back into wherever you're storing that hydrogen.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm glad you brought up that point. So I think one of the important things, if we zoom out in terms of looking at the climate crisis and public health for that matter, reducing criteria, pollution, and all of that, is that no one solution is going to fix everything. So we have renewables like wind and solar in many cases that work very, very well. Batteries in most cases, like just straight electrification, is going to work very, very well, especially for consumer facing things like EVs, home electrification, the electrification of most businesses, I think, and buildings and things like that are going to be possible. And even in some cases, public transit, electrification should be an adequate solution. But if you look at the hardest to abate sectors, you're talking about 30% or so of global emissions, climate change causing emissions, and hard to abate sectors, meaning they're very hard to decarbonize. And it's not that easy to stick a battery, or it might even be impossible technologically as it stands now to stick a battery in those types of applications. So hydrogen is really, the way that we're looking at it, is a targeted tool that will help fill certain roles where batteries are not practical, or they're too heavy, or they're too big, or they discharge too quickly and it takes too long to charge up. And I know all of that technology is going to get better at some point too, but there are going to be, I think, leftover, pieces of the puzzle that we have to figure out how to decarbonize. Because if we do everything that we can and then forget about that 30%, we're still not going to hit our climate benchmarks, right? So that's sort of how we're looking at hydrogen. Is it's a really targeted and promising tool in a much broader suite of tools that we have at our disposal to try to decarbonize as quickly as we possibly can. Because we don't have much time generally.
I know they say that essentially you could turn hydrogen into hydrocarbons. So you could pretty much duplicate fossil fuels, and they can also turn hydrogen into ammonia. So the air we breathe is about 80% nitrogen. And so ammonia is nitrogen and hydrogen, and they could turn hydrogen into ammonia and then use that for a fuel too. Imagine it might smell a little bit if there's a leak. Because ammonia doesn't smell that great. But those are some of the things that they're talking about. And so you could essentially make even like jet fuel out of hydrogen.
Yeah, I mean, that's the idea. So, aviation is a great example of something that's not easy to put a battery in because those batteries weigh a ton. So, imagine figuring out fuel cell technology that's lighter and easier to refuel and, has enough energy density to work for aviation. Maritime shipping, that is another area that hydrogen could come in handy. The big container ships are not clean for the most part, so those are big emitters, cruise ships, even things like that. Public transit in some places. So, this is kind of an interesting thing. But if your city is in a climate where a good chunk of the year it gets very cold and is hilly, you're going to have a difficult time with batteries too, because they discharge too quickly in the cold. And then you're taking buses, specifically buses, out of service too often. So hydrogen could provide an alternative to that, a more reliable, consistent alternative to EV buses in those cases. And in flatter, warmer cities, batteries should work okay. Even for school buses in most cases, right? Because if you think about it, you're doing a morning run and then they're off during the middle of the day for the most part. And then in the afternoon, they're running again. So there's plenty of time to charge. But a bus that runs a route regularly all day long, I mean, you can't really afford to take it out of service for 2 or 3 hours while you charge it up and, swap another bus in. So there are a lot of opportunities to decarbonize things. You mentioned ammonia too. That's another area where you need ammonia for a lot of things today. Like we produce ammonia today for a lot of applications, whether it's cleaning products or for agricultural applications as well. So essentially you're displacing all of the fossil fuels and all of the dirty stuff that goes into the production of those things that we absolutely need. I mean, I don't think anyone would argue we don't need ammonia for these various applications. So I think clean hydrogen provides an opportunity to decarbonize those areas as well.
Right. Yeah. When you were talking about the school buses, it kind of reminded me. I went to 3 high schools, but I graduated from high school up in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And I was probably less than an hour. I can't remember the exact time, but it's like going up a hill. And sometimes, you're looking at snow out of the windows. And some people probably were commuting like an hour and a half on the bus. So that bus had to do like an hour and a half up the Sierras. And that would be kind of hard on the battery when it was like you were saying, especially when it's snowing and you don't want to get stuck and all that kind of stuff. So that does sound like a pretty good hydrogen application right there. And I know that even when they were trying to figure out how to make electric vehicles work, they were talking about using hydrogen rather than lithium ion batteries. But it seems that lithium ion batteries kind of won the battle on that for the most part. But one of the reasons why was probably to do with the range anxiety, because lithium ion batteries are kind of heavy and then hydrogen is a lot lighter. And also another thing too with hydrogen is you can fill it up real quick where, you don't have to sit around and wait for the battery to charge. I know that there is technology where they can charge these batteries pretty quick, but as an electric vehicle driver, I've noticed that range anxiety really doesn't happen. I mean, unless you were somebody that had a 200-mile commute, something like that. And even if you had a 200-mile commute, there are cars that could do that and you could charge them overnight. You probably would also charge them while you're working.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I mean, I think for most consumer facing applications, again, like EVs, your average commuter that's not really driving too far, but to and from work, batteries work fine. EVs work okay. There's no issue there. It's for others. I mean, to your point about, driving school buses up steep mountain passes and in cooler weather, that's a different story. Long haul trucking, I mean, that's another area where if you stick a battery in some of these 18-wheeler tractor trailer type trucks, they're just too heavy. They take up too much space and then your payloads are a lot smaller and that becomes pretty inefficient. So hydrogen could definitely play a role in long haul shipping and logistics as well.
Yeah, and a lot of them want to drive like 1,000 miles without stopping more than 5 minutes, something like that. Sounds like a good job to me. And so, what do you think the future of hydrogen's going to be? Do you see it taking off a lot more? What's your view on that?
I think so. I do think that there is a lot of promise in, again, those hard to decarbonize areas. So I'm optimistic that it will take off in some of the industries and sectors that we just discussed. And I also think, just based on what I'm seeing already, there's a lot of thought around developing, sort of clean energy innovation ecosystems around some of the hydrogen hubs. So not only are you thinking about the production and consumption of hydrogen, but you're also thinking about the renewables that go into it, creating behind the meter capacity, innovating in technology technology. Workforce development is a huge piece of it. So I really do think that given, quite frankly, the smart federal investment in this technology and in a lot of other climate solutions, that we're going to see adoption of hydrogen. And again, I don't think it's going to be something that will be applied to most, again, consumer facing lightweight kind of applications. I just don't see it, except under certain circumstances. I don't see that adoption there, but I do see adoption in these really hard to abate sectors. And there's plenty of demand in those areas to really push this forward. I think hydrogen is going to be a really important tool in trying to combat climate change. Again, nothing is perfect. There is no single perfect solution. I think, you and I would both agree that if we could flip a switch and turn climate change off today, we would do that, but we don't have that switch available to us, unfortunately. So,
Oh, wait a second. I have one right here. Yeah.
you've had it all along, huh? That's you
Yeah, I
got the
just forgot to flip it. I was kind of
darned.
busy. Yeah.
Okay, well, it looks like we solved something here today.
Yeah. Are there hydrogen pipelines going out there, or what's the status of that?
Sure. So one of the strengths of the Mach 2 region in particular, and I can't speak as much to some of the other hubs, was that we have a lot of existing infrastructure or rights of way for that connective infrastructure, so pipelines. Now, for the pipelines that exist, there is very, very likely going to have to be some refurbishment of those pipelines, retooling of those pipelines, different membranes, smart pipes and sensors and things like that installed in certain places because of the sort of refining history. So there is a history of the refining industry in this particular region. There is a lot of connective infrastructure that exists already, which should reduce the amount of disruption that would have to occur if you didn't have that infrastructure already in place. So really, we're looking at resleeving, retooling, refurbishing. And in certain cases, maybe you do need some new pipe to accommodate hydrogen safely. But again, the most important thing is that there should be pretty minimal disruption overall because of the history of refining in the area.
So when you talk about things like resleeving and retooling and things like that, is that converting natural gas pipes to work for hydrogen? And once you do switch it over, could you still switch it back to natural gas, or how does that work?
I'm not 100% sure if you could switch it back to natural gas, but in some cases, it would be taking natural gas pipelines. In some cases, it would be taking pipelines that transported crude or other things like that and sleeving them. And in some cases, it's just we're talking about rights of way that already exist, where pipelines already exist. And it would be just, dropping a new section of pipe in for something. So it is repurposing as much as you can safely and updating all of that to meet the rigorous standards and environmental standards that exist.
And any idea what resleeving is? Are they using some kind of plastic in there or something that's going to be real tight?
Yeah, so specifically, I mean, there are a bunch of different technologies, but that's a pretty high level explanation of what would be happening are different materials like plastics or other types of membranes that accommodate hydrogen effectively, as opposed to just, steel pipes where there is some, not super significant, but there is some risk of degradation of steel from hydrogen. So it would essentially be lining the pipes with materials that are designed to accommodate hydrogen.
Yeah, I remember somebody once telling me a long time ago, and I don't know if this is true, but maybe there's some truth to it, that when they're sending natural gas, there's leaks in the system. And I'm not sure if it's all in the pipeline or in different places, but the greenhouse effect from those leaks was somewhat equivalent to or comparable to the amount of greenhouse gases and the greenhouse effect of burning the methane. And I imagine too, if you can have methane leak, then you're going to have a lot more hydrogen leak. But for sure, the hydrogen leaks, they're not going to be causing a greenhouse gas problem, except I guess the greenhouse gas problem would be if the hydrogen doesn't make it there, then somebody's going to turn on some other power plant that might be causing greenhouse effects.
Yeah, I mean, really, you want to limit as much of that as possible. And I think limiting it significantly is certainly possible with new sensor technology that exists. And again, the membranes and ways of monitoring these sorts of things. So, the goal is ultimately to not have any leaks at all or minimize any risk of that sort of thing happening. So, and again, there's going to be a lot of research and development that goes into materials development and the technologies that are going to enable that. So, I mean, hydrogen definitely not a greenhouse gas. There's some debate as to whether or not it could at a large scale exacerbate some effects of certain climate change causing gases, but the idea is to limit as much of the possibility of a leak as possible. So that's something that we're going to see a lot of, again, is that research and development and looking into how to develop this ecosystem in a way that is safe and environmentally and actually accomplishes the goal too, because you really don't want to be doing anything that is going to make the climate crisis worse unintentionally, right? So that's the idea, is like, how do we do hydrogen right? And I think a lot of that is, again, limiting any kind of leak.
Yeah, and we know that hydrogen is explosive. Some people might remember watching that movie, The Hindenburg, or I guess you could probably still watch it out there somewhere. So that would be just another thing to look at. But anytime you have energy and you're storing it, there's some problem for explosion. One example of hydrogen too that people might not know about is, remember that space shuttle, and they had that big orange tank that was bigger than the space shuttle. That was hydrogen and oxygen in there. And so it can explode. We can use that to our benefit. But of course, other things explode too. Like we were talking about methane, which is natural gas. You can have jet fuel, you can have gasoline in your car. All those things are very explosive. And another thing that you mentioned too was smart pipe and sensors. Do you know much about those? It sounds kind of neat. There's probably jobs there, figuring out how to redo the pipe. I wonder how they redo the pipe.
Yeah, specifically, I don't have a ton of insight into how the sensors work and how the smart pipe works, or the sort of chemical makeup or engineering makeup of the materials that would go into something like that. But there is going to be a fair amount of job creation, a significant amount of job creation as a result of the H2 Hubs program. So in our hub alone, what we're looking at is somewhere in the neighborhood of like 20,000 or so brand new jobs in this clean hydrogen economy will be created in this region specifically because of it.
And that's the Mach 2 Mid-Atlantic. That's the MA is Mid-Atlantic. So Mid-Atlantic, when they talk about Mid-Atlantic, I know that's like around Washington, D.C., because I've taught a lot of classes for Grid Alternatives Mid-Atlantic located in Washington, D.C. But how big is that region? How far does it go?
So specifically for the purposes of the hydrogen hub right now, we're talking about Southeast Pennsylvania. So, Philadelphia for the most part, and then all of Delaware, and then Southern New Jersey. Well, it's like the Philadelphia region, but like south of Interstate 195 is kind of the cutoff that we use for that. So that is the defined region as it stands today. Could that expand at some point to connect in other areas in the region? Yeah, I think that's certainly a possibility. But right now, that's what we're looking at in terms of specific investments in this area.
Great. We interrupt you for a very important announcement. Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast has been brought to you by Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. That's right, Sean White is sponsoring his own podcast, and he wants to remind you to go check out some of his classes. You can go to SolarSean, that's solar, SEAN.com, and then click on the links to check out his classes. You can check out his heat spring classes, and you can also hire him to teach classes for you, like at your company, something like that. Now back to the show. Yeah, I remember taking the Amtrak from DC to New York, and I think it goes through Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
And so what is that? How far is it? Like, it would maybe be like an hour drive if it was midnight and there was no traffic?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking maybe an hour and 15, hour and 20 minutes. It's not a bad drive at all from New York City. So I'm up in northern New Jersey, actually, and it takes me about an hour and a half on, a good day to get down to Philly via car. Amtrak, though, I will say, very convenient. Love the train. So, I'm up and back from DC frequently, and I love the Acela. So that'll get you there in 2 hours and 45 minutes or something. So you really can't beat it.
And then is that the train that Joe Biden took back in the day when after his kids died and his wife died, and then he was commuting and all that kind of stuff? The Acela?
Not the Acela, but the old school Amtrak. Sure, yeah. So he has a special love for the Northeast Corridor Amtrak trains, which is good. So he was sort of known as the Amtrak senator. So I know he would take that up and back every day to Delaware.
Yeah, then how far from DC to Philly?
By train, I think we're talking probably about an hour and 45 minutes. It's not too bad.
Yeah, time flies when you're working on your computer.
It does. Yeah, definitely. So it's a pretty good experience. On one of the regular trains that makes more frequent stops, I mean, that's really what gets you, or the stops in between. So the Acela only stops in a few locations. So you get from up here, it's like New York, Newark, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Wilmington, BWI, Baltimore, and then you hit DC. If you have a train that makes a ton of stops, I mean, you're talking from Philly, probably 2.5 hours down there. So just like a regular Amtrak.
Yeah, great. Good areas over there. You said like this hydrogen hub, so they're talking about running pipe or refurbishing pipe. It would go as far as from DC to Philadelphia?
No. So as far south as Delaware right now. So it's really just 3 states are involved in this particular hub. So it's going to be Delaware, again, Southeast Pennsylvania, and Southern New Jersey. And then I'm not sure, in the future if connectivity may extend beyond that area, but at the moment, it's as far south as Delaware.
Okay. So I'm looking like Washington to Delaware. It looks like it's 90 miles.
Somewhere in there. That sounds about right.
So that's kind of a long pipe.
Yeah, there are no plans as of now to build anything like that in the region. So I think the benefit of the very defined region that we have, again, the sort of Delaware, South Jersey, southeastern Pennsylvania area, is that there are a ton of opportunities for offtake or hydrogen demand. Again, there's a history of refining in this area, heavy industry, airports. I mean, it's a hub for transportation and logistics and other types of heavy manufacturing. So I think the main focus right now is just getting this up and running in this area. And then maybe there's a possibility in the future, but first you got to make sure you do it right in a smaller footprint.
Great, great. And you said that was one of a bunch of hubs. Do you have some examples of other hubs?
Sure. So there are 7 total. I'm going to draw a blank on where exactly they are. So there is one in Western Pennsylvania and West Virginia, which is called the Arch 2 hub. So that's the Appalachia region. I think there might be a tiny slice of Ohio in that one as well. California has a hub, Arches. There's an Upper Midwest hub, a Gulf Coast hub, and I feel like I'm missing a couple, but yeah, there are 7 total.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a bunch. And then physically, is there something that qualifies as a hub, or it's just kind of an idea of where they're going to do stuff?
So it's really just a collection of proposed projects, and whether those are offtake projects or production projects. And that's how the applications went in. So a bunch of different regions and areas and project partners, whether it's private sector partners, academic institutions, and other sorts of organizations, came together and tried to identify as a part of the application process which projects would be a part of a hub or could be a part of a hub, and how would they serve the broader goals of the H2 Hubs program. So in our case, it's again that sort of network of the producers and consumers and infrastructures. And that's sort of the genesis of this. And the different regions were able to identify different types of projects or different applications or specific applications for what they might do with it. But yeah, in our case, it's really, again, displacing a lot of those fossil fuel usage in the area. So
Great, great. So it sounds to me like the hub isn't really a physical thing, but they're putting a bunch of different hydrogen companies in a certain region.
yeah, that's fair. Hydrogen companies, and then also developing a market for the offtake. So making sure that some of those projects within the region are able to serve as demand centers for hydrogen. So, for example, one of the Mach 2 projects that is on the docket in terms of offtake is SEPTA. So the Southeast Pennsylvania Transportation Authority. They are looking to convert buses to hydrogen fuel cell buses. So that would take not entirely clean diesel buses out of service and replace them with hydrogen fuel cell buses. So it's also helping to support those efforts to create hydrogen offtake. Another application too, right off the bat for hydrogen in the area, a couple of the projects are actually a few of the legacy refiners that exist in the area. And one of the things that you need in a refinery is steam to open and close valves and different pipes and different things that they're already doing in terms of their industrial processes. So hydrogen can be used to create that steam cleanly as opposed to using natural gas right now. So that's a part of the hub. On the offtake side, creating demand centers, and there are a whole bunch of other potential applications for it. And then setting up the production, so companies, and then also creating a real community benefits plan, which is mandatory for all of the hubs to create. So each of the projects and each of the hubs have to provide community benefits specifically targeted at overburdened, underserved communities in the region. And, a big part of that is, again, developing academic partnerships too with workforce development boards, local universities. So as a part of our hub in particular, we have a bunch of great universities, research universities, other types of universities and colleges that are involved. So University of Delaware, for example, is a part of it, doing research and development into the actual development of electrolyzer technology and other types of technologies related to hydrogen, but then also helping to train undergrads to work in a clean energy economy. We have also, as a part of the hub, really good relationships with organized labor. So that was another feature of our hub in particular, where we had from day one labor unions at the table, so that every project is going to have a project labor agreement included with it. So there are actually a lot of different pieces in addition to setting up the hydrogen producing companies or supporting the companies that are planning to produce hydrogen. You also have that workforce development aspect, organized labor at the table, and community benefits. So all of those pieces kind of make up the hub as a whole.
So is this involved with the Inflation Reduction Act? Is that where some of the money's coming from, or a lot of the money?
So for the Hydrogen Hubs project, the funding for that came from the bipartisan infrastructure law. And then there's a separate piece of the puzzle included in the Inflation Reduction Act where there are tax credits for creating clean hydrogen called, 45V, which is the regulation that governs that. And that's currently being drafted, I believe. So the IRA does provide for tax credits for the production of clean hydrogen.
And if there's a change in the administration, is there a danger that some of these benefits could go away, like the IRA and all that kind of stuff?
It's hard to say, so not speaking on behalf of the hub in particular, but I think a lot of the investment that we've seen in clean energy and renewables and the energy transition could certainly be at risk. I mean, I don't see any indication that a change in administrations would spur any further development at best of clean energy and investment in new technologies and manufacturing in the United States and all of the things that a lot of folks, I think, want and need for both protecting property from increasing extreme weather to, again, public health outcomes. So we're not going to get more from a new administration. I'll put it that way. I think from the Biden administration, they have demonstrated a very clear commitment to doing as much as they can to invest in combating climate change, but also then creating good American jobs, which is a huge thing. So, I mean, if you look at the mid-Atlantic region, in this particular region, you haven't seen a whole lot of investment over the years in this area. And all of a sudden you have, an administration that's paying attention, that understands, again, we have to do something about climate change, understands that the next generation of clean energy jobs really can and should be American jobs. So I don't think we'll get a whole lot out of a new administration on that front. I think they've been pretty clear, like offshore wind, for example, that has been targeted very clearly by Donald Trump. He did a rally not too long ago in Wildwood, New Jersey, South Jersey, and, went on a little bit of a riff about offshore wind and shutting that down. So I don't have any reason to not believe what he has said already about how he would pursue energy policy in this country.
Well, maybe they could just change it from Mid-Atlantic Clean Hydrogen Hub to Mid-Atlantic Dirty Hydrogen Hub. Maybe that would just be all it takes, huh?
Maybe. I don't know. Wouldn't do as much good, would it? So that's the
Yeah, and then they could just do that black hydrogen that they make from coal, something like that.
Oh yeah, go straight in the opposite direction, right? And create even more emissions. Yeah, that would be pretty par for the course, unfortunately. So look, I don't want to speak to the specifics of what programs could or could not go away, but I think we have the very clear, broad outlines of the intent of what a Trump administration would do and what they would strip away and scale back on. And I think the Biden administration, beyond what they've said they want to do, has demonstrated action in a lot of these areas. And, I have no doubt that they would 100% continue to do those things and continue to innovate and figure out ways to spur on this investment in trying to create a future for generations to come.
Yeah, I mean, it looks to me when I first heard about the Inflation Reduction Act, I wanted to change it to the Incredible Renewables Act because it seemed to me like it was the best thing that the world ever had for renewable energy. And you were also talking about the Infrastructure Act. How do you say it again?
Bipartisan infrastructure law.
Bipartisan infrastructure law or whatever it is. So, I mean, those are just some of the coolest things ever. And another thing too is I know that you're just out there in that part of the world, and I know that you don't just work with hydrogen, but you've worked in politics. Do you have any comment on the future of manufacturing? Like I was just answering emails today that people are just like, I need some made in America lithium iron phosphate batteries. And it takes a while to build these factories. And so do you have any comments on that kind of stuff? It could have to do with hydrogen or not. It's whatever you want.
Yeah, no, I think from a politics and policy perspective, we have seen generational investments in reshoring manufacturing in America and developing American manufacturing capacity, both high tech through the CHIPS Act. So the manufacturing of computer chips that are essential for everything that we need, like from computers to cars to whatever it is.
I mean, it's really important too for what we're doing, like chips for renewable energy, making more efficient server farms, and also controlling what our energy is doing and which direction it's going on the power lines.
Absolutely. So I think the Biden administration has been fairly clear about what their vision is and then executing on that vision in a way that I don't think any administration has been able to do for a very long time. And I think genuinely we're looking at one of the most sort of effective presidencies from a legislative perspective from doing all of these things. To your point, it does take a while to build the capacity for these things, but you have to start somewhere, which is, okay, we're going to make the investment today. And then these factories are going to start to come online. We're going to start to build that capacity. Because I think, if the pandemic really showed us a lot of different things and revealed a lot of sort of uncomfortable truths about the world that we live in. But one of the lessons learned is that our supply chain is very, very fragile. And the more of this sort of critical manufacturing and critical production of technologies that we can do in America, I think the better off we are. And genuinely, I think, the private sector is starting to see this as more cost effective than trying to offshore stuff, because there is risk inherent with having these big, broad supply chains. Now, I'm not saying shut down global trade in a way, but I think America can and is becoming a leader in this space in a way that it hadn't been for years. So manufacturing is an incredibly important component of this. This president has done a fantastic job, I think, of doing it. But again, it's a really hard thing to communicate to people because you don't see it happening today. You see some of it today, but it's not all happening today. And you wish it would, but
Yeah, I think maybe part of why, he's not taking as much credit for it is that's how he gets these bills passed. He kind of knows how it works over there in Washington. And then it's like kind of low key, let's make this happen. Let's call it inflation instead of green energy and all that kind of stuff. And that gets it to happen. And then he also gets a little bit less credit for it because it is called inflation. And that's just an example, not just that. But
I think that's a really good point. Again, not to get too political, and obviously I have my clear biases in this whole thing, but like I don't think you're going to find another person who has Washington figured out in the way that Biden administration does. And that's a good thing for the American people. So do you get the flashy sort of presentation all of the time? No, but do you get cheaper insulin? For example, yeah, you're going to get that. You're going to get better healthcare. You're going to get better investments in the economy, a greater transfer of power to everyday American workers, which is something that we haven't seen. So, I think credit is tough, right? I mean, under any circumstance, even if you're standing atop the Capitol steps and pounding your chest and screaming, I mean, at the end of the day, our media environment is so fractured. People get their information from 1,000 different places. So for any one thing to break through, it's very, very difficult to do for any politician, any president, anyone that's trying to advance a certain policy agenda. It's extraordinarily difficult to really crack through to that broad national narrative when there's so much stuff actually happening. So it's not easy.
yeah, and I almost think too, like I was saying before about inflation, if they just were out there shouting like, we're going to fight climate change and all that, it's just going to make a whole bunch of people that they need to agree with, say like, I can't really support that because a lot of my voters don't support climate change. And so it's like, well, let's call it inflation.
It was very smart. I think it was smart. And genuinely, it did reduce the cost of certain things that are critical. Again, like insulin cost. I mean, tons of people use insulin, right? And that's the non negotiable in people. It's not like if you need insulin, you could just go, maybe I can do it. That's not reality. So it does actually get at inflation. I like your branding of the Incredible Renewables Act, too. I think it's great. And that's an interesting point, though, in what people support and they don't, because we do a lot of polling and research, too, on like policy and people's thinking about different clean energy policies or modes of energy production and how they think about climate change. And you do see actually a real partisan divide, even among voters, where certain issues become very polarized. I'll give you an example of this. This is going to well, maybe it won't blow your mind, because in some ways it's surprising, but also completely expected. So we did some polling not too long ago where we asked folks if their lives had been impacted by extreme weather recently. Now, in some of these areas that we polled, we knew for a fact that there had been some extreme weather. So it was, I think in this particular case, extraordinarily heavy rainfall to the magnitude that you wouldn't have seen like when I was a kid, right? I do not remember rainstorms like the ones that we are seeing now. For a personal example, where our office is located in northern New Jersey, we're not located anywhere near any major body of water, river, anything like that. We have had major flooding, flash flooding down the main street because of the sheer volume of rainfall that we get in a short amount of time. That is unusual. I mean, we're talking about events that used to be 100-year events happening every 5-10 years now, maybe even more frequently than that. So you ask people if their lives have been impacted by extreme weather, and you know for a fact that their basement was like flooded the week before, right? There was just no way. The whole town was just underwater for one reason or another. And you see a very clear partisan divide on whether people are even willing to admit that they experienced extreme weather. Isn't that crazy? So
Yeah.
objective reality, right? So your basement could be flooded and my basement could be flooded. But if you have a different partisan lens on, you're going to say, well, this happens.
Yeah.
Not extreme. It's just normal.
Yeah, it's crazy. Just like depends on which news station they're used to and which one hypes it up and all that kind of stuff. Some of those news stations where they're so negative, to me, it's just like scratching the chalkboard. It sounds like that.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I think certain terms too become polarized. I mean, climate change definitely polarized, but now you're talking about extreme weather. And now that that has been used to describe the sort of impacts of climate change more frequently, you are starting to see polarization in how people interpret the weather and the impacts of
Mhm.
weather on their own existence. And it's not some abstract thing. It's, was your house flooded yesterday or was it not? Sort of
Yeah.
like, so it's pretty crazy to think about that. So we have to do a lot of thinking about, okay, how can you, as a communicator, as people who, we understand that you have to have policy in place that is going to combat climate change, that is going to help advance the ball on some of these things, because quite frankly, we don't have a lot of time to address them. How can we talk to people in a way that makes sense, that speaks to their experience, that kind of breaks down that partisan wall to help get them into a place where they feel comfortable at least admitting the objective reality of something, and then we can get to a solution of, okay, well, we see this is happening more, so how can we mitigate the impacts, how can we reduce the causes of these things? So it's really interesting time to be thinking through some of these big problems.
Great, great. And so is there anything else that you want to cover before we finish?
No, I mean, I think we covered a lot of it. I mean, there's a lot of exciting stuff happening right now, and I'm optimistic that we'll be able to make real impact and continue to make an impact. And again, one thing that I'll leave it with, based on, again, some of the research that we do on public opinion, is that I think as we all talk to people about policy and how we can make a difference here, it's important to make things as concrete as possible, because I think climate change, if you talk about it that way, or renewables, it's so big that it almost feels like, okay, well, what can I do? Or what can any of us do to stop this? So I'm just not going to pay attention to it. So I think, making things as concrete as possible and connecting things to people's daily lives is extraordinarily helpful in helping move the ball forward on things. Like, for example, again, I'll just provide one more example as we leave it here, is solar, for example. You'll see a lot more support for solar development than you do in some places offshore wind. Why is that? Well, my working theory, and we're trying to test some of this, is that you can put solar panels on your own roof, right? So that's very concrete. Like, what a solar panel is, what it does. You can look at your bill every month, see how much energy you're generating via solar. So that has a very direct connection. Offshore wind is like, it's this sort of far off big concept that people don't connect in with their daily lives. So it's like you do see actually a little bit of a split, even where solar tends to be a lot more popular, because people across the political spectrum have put solar panels on their roofs because it saves money in some cases.
Yeah, it is kind of amazing to me how many people that are super right wing are doing renewable energy for different reasons. They're not doing it for climate change, but it's just like, I don't want to give all my money to the man and that, the utility, and I want to be self-sufficient, and I don't want to be buying foreign oil, all that kind of stuff. And this car is really fast, that kind of stuff. So,
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, look at Tesla, right? That's sort of become a little more right coded than it used to be. So Tesla used to be a very left coded thing, like EVs, Tesla, whatever. Now, because of the antics of the CEO, I think it's picking up a little bit of that right code when you think about brand and what people think. So it's interesting to see how those things shift as well, to your point about like how people apply their own logic to get essentially to the same endpoint, which is getting an EV or putting solar on the roof.
well, as long as they're doing that, that's what's important.
Hey, however they get there, right? Doesn't matter.
Yep. And so you were mentioning, what can I do? And one of the things that people could do is to get NABCEP certified and take my classes. And so go to solarsean.com and check that out. And so just to kind of finish up, do you want to just tell people where to find you? And then also, do you need clients or anything like that? Or how can we help you out?
Sure. Yeah. No, I, enjoyed talking about this stuff and sharing some of the things that we're learning along the way. So you can find me on LinkedIn, Matt Krayton, or Matthew Krayton might be on there. And then my firm has a presence on
So
there as well.
that's Krayton. And we'll put it in the show notes too.
Yep, that's correct. And then my firm, Publitics, so that's Publilics, has a presence on LinkedIn as well. And we're starting to publish with more frequency our newsletter, the Influence IQ newsletter. So that's influenceiq.publitics.com. So if you want to check that out, we're starting to post more on our research on attitudes toward renewable energy, environmental policy, voting behavior, you name it, we're putting it all out there. So
Great, great. Well, thanks for being on the podcast, Matt Krayton. And thanks for listening to Shaun White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast.
thanks for having me.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks so much.